Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. The lighthouse at Barrow's End. The storm had been raging for 3 days straight when I arrived at Barrow's End Lighthouse. The taxi driver refused to take me all the way, dropping me off at the base of the cliff path with a look that made it clear he thought I was insane. Last keeper went mad, you know, he said, rain hammering on the roof of his car. Found him writing on the walls with his own blood, kept babbling about ships that weren't there. I forced a smile. That's why they're paying me double. He didn't return the smile. No amount of money's worth it, not at Barrow's End. I'd heard all the stories during my briefing with the Maritime Safety Authority. How the lighthouse had gone through 6 keepers in 3 years. How the last one had indeed been found in a disturbing state, though the official report cited extreme isolation and stress rather than anything supernatural. How they were desperate enough to hire me, a former naval officer with no lighthouse experience, just to keep the light running until they could install the automated system in 6 months. The path up to the lighthouse was treacherous, especially in the storm. My boots slipped on mud and loose stones as I hauled my duffel bag up the narrow trail. The wind howled around me, and several times I had to stop and press myself against the cliff face to avoid being blown off the edge. By the time I reached the top, I was drenched and exhausted. The lighthouse stood before me, a stark white tower against the darkening sky. It was older than most still in operation, built in 1887 according to my briefing. The keeper's quarters were attached to the base, a small, 2-story stone building that looked as weathered as the cliffs it stood upon. I fumbled with the keys they'd given me, finally getting the heavy wooden door open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust and disuse. I flipped a switch, and a single bulb illuminated a sparse living room with outdated furniture. Home sweet home, I muttered to myself. The electricity worked at least. I spent the next hour exploring my new residence, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and a small office. Everything was functional but dated. The previous keeper had left few personal touches, except for a desk drawer full of notebooks in the office, which I decided to examine later. The maintenance checklist on the wall reminded me of my primary duty. I needed to ensure the light was operational before nightfall. I found the door leading to the tower and began the climb up the spiral staircase. The lighthouse itself was in better condition than the living quarters. The MSA had at least kept the important parts well maintained. At the top, I found the enormous Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of prisms and brass that would project the light for miles out to sea. I went through the startup procedure I'd been taught, and soon the mechanism hummed to life. The light began to rotate, sending its beam out into the gathering darkness and driving rain. I stood there for a moment, watching it sweep across the turbulent ocean below. That's when I saw it, the first ship. It appeared suddenly in the beam of light, much closer to shore than any vessel should have been in this weather. A sailing ship with tall masts and billowing sails that should have been torn to shreds in this storm. It was there for just a moment as the light swept past, then gone in the darkness. I blinked, convinced I'd imagined it. When the light rotated back around, the area was empty, just angry waves crashing against the rocks. I rubbed my eyes. The long journey and climb must have tired me more than I realized. I returned downstairs and unpacked my things, made a simple dinner from the supplies I'd brought, and tried to settle in. The wind howled around the building, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. The sound was maddening, like distant voices just below the threshold of comprehension. That night I slept poorly. The storm continued unabated, and strange dreams plagued what little sleep I managed to get. I dreamed of ships, dozens of them, circling the lighthouse like moths around a flame. In my dream, I could see faces pressed against their portholes, pale and desperate. I awoke at dawn, groggy and unsettled. The storm had lessened somewhat, though rain still fell steadily. I made coffee and decided to properly examine the lighthouse logs and the notebooks left by the previous keeper. The official logs were mundane, weather reports, maintenance records, occasional notes about ships passing in the distance. Nothing unusual until the final entries, which became increasingly erratic. October 15. Spotted vessel approximately 2 miles offshore, not responding to radio, no registry match. October 16, same vessel seen again, impossible, checked position 3 times, it's a clipper ship, we don't have clipper ships anymore. October 18, 3 ships tonight, all old, all wrong, they're not showing up on radar. October 21, they're watching me. The last official entry was dated 3 days before the keeper was found by the supply boat, writing on the walls. I set the logbook aside and opened one of the personal notebooks. The handwriting started neat but grew more frantic with each page. The keeper, a man named Thomas Welch, had begun documenting what he called ghost ships. I know how it sounds. I'm not crazy, these ships aren't modern, they're from another time. The oldest appears to be from the early 19th century. They appear in the light, then vanish. Sometimes they're there for hours, circling. I've tried taking photos, but they don't show up. I flipped through more pages. Welch had drawn some of the ships with remarkable detail: a three-masted clipper, a steam-powered vessel from perhaps the 1920s, a fishing trawler that looked more modern but still decades old. They're getting closer each night. I think they want something. The final pages were barely legible, the writing jagged and pressed so hard into the paper that it tore in places. They're calling my name. How do they know my name? The people on board, something's wrong with their eyes. They're black, all black, no whites, just emptiness. They want me to join them. They say I belong with them. They say all keepers belong with them eventually. I can't sleep. They tap on the windows at night. The last entry was simply, "They're coming inside tonight." I closed the notebook, a chill running through me despite the heating system's valiant efforts against the damp. I told myself that Welch had clearly suffered some kind of psychological break. Isolation could do that to people. It was well documented. That's why modern lighthouses were automated. But as I stared out the window at the gray sea beyond, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. That day, I busied myself with maintenance tasks and cleaning the living quarters. The previous keeper might have gone mad, but he'd also let the place fall into disarray. I found strange symbols carved into the undersides of furniture, salt poured in lines across thresholds, and mirrors positioned at odd angles throughout the house. I removed most of these oddities, telling myself they were just manifestations of Welch's deteriorating mental state. But I left the salt lines, for no reason I could articulate even to myself. As dusk approached, I climbed the tower again to ensure the light was functioning properly. The storm had finally passed, leaving a heavy mist in its wake that shrouded the sea in ghostly white. Visibility was poor, making the lighthouse's function all the more critical. I stayed in the lantern room longer than necessary, watching the beam cut through the fog. Part of me was waiting, though I wouldn't admit it then. Waiting to see if what Welch had documented, what I thought I'd glimpsed the night before, would appear again. An hour passed, nothing but mist and waves. I began to feel foolish and turned to descend the stairs. That's when I heard it, the sound of a ship's bell, clear and distinct despite the distance it must have traveled. I rushed back to the glass and peered out into the darkness. The light swept across the water, and there it was. A fishing trawler, perhaps from the 1960s by its design, sitting low in the water about half a mile offshore. Its hull was rusted, its paint peeling, but its running lights were on weak, yellowed glows in the mist. I grabbed the binoculars kept in the lantern room and focused on the vessel. It shouldn't have been there. The waters near the lighthouse were too treacherous for a ship that size to navigate safely, especially in such poor visibility. Through the binoculars, I could make out the name on the hull, Lady Constance. The deck appeared empty, but as the light swept over it again, I saw movement. A figure stood at the rail, looking directly at the lighthouse, directly at me. I nearly dropped the binoculars. The figure raised an arm, a clear gesture of greeting or beckoning. I stumbled back from the window, heart pounding. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a replica vessel for tourists. Perhaps they were in trouble and seeking guidance. I rushed down to the radio room and tried to contact the ship. "Fishing vessel Lady Constance, this is Barrow's End Lighthouse. Do you copy?" "Are you in distress?" Nothing but static answered me. I repeated the call several times, then tried the emergency channel. Still nothing. When I returned to the lantern room with a more powerful spotlight, the ship was gone. No trace remained on the now clear horizon, not even a wake in the water. I spent the rest of the night searching maritime databases on the lighthouse's outdated computer. What I found chilled me to the bone. The Lady Constance had been lost with all hands in a storm off Barrow's End in 1973. Her wreckage had never been recovered. Sleep eluded me that night. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cooling coffee, poring over Welch's notebooks and the historical records of the lighthouse that I'd found in a dusty cabinet. The history of Barrow's End was darker than my briefing had indicated. Since its construction, the lighthouse had seen an unusual number of keeper disappearances and deaths, far above the national average. Most were ruled suicides or accidents, but the patterns were disturbing. Many occurred after keepers reported unusual sightings at sea. Some bodies were never found, the keepers simply vanishing between supply visits. I must have dozed off eventually because I awoke with a start at the kitchen table. Dawn was breaking, and a thin ray of sunlight cut through the window. Something had woken me, a sound. It came again. A heavy thud from somewhere outside, like something being dropped on the dock at the base of the cliff. I went to the window but could see nothing unusual. The dock was empty, the small maintenance boat still secured where it should be. The morning was clear, the sea calm, a perfect day after the storm. I decided to walk down to the dock to investigate. The path was still muddy from the rain, but the descent was easier than my arrival had been. At the dock I found nothing out of place except for a single wooden barrel, old and weathered, that must have washed up during the storm. I approached it cautiously. It was the kind once used to transport goods by sea, with metal bands around it, now rusted and fragile. The wood was sodden and covered in barnacles, suggesting it had been in the water for a very long time. What disturbed me was that it sat perfectly upright in the center of the dock, as if placed there deliberately. It would have taken considerable force for the waves to deposit it so neatly. I should have pushed it back into the sea. Instead, I pried open the lid. Inside was a ship's logbook, its pages somehow dry despite the waterlogged container. The entries dated back to 1887, the year the lighthouse was built. It was from a ship called the Morrow's Promise, and the final entry read, November 4, 1887, the light guides us wrong. It is not a salvation but a lure. God forgive the keeper for what he does. I took the logbook back to the lighthouse, an inexplicable dread building within me. The coincidence was too great, this specific barrel washing up during my first days as keeper, containing a logbook from the very year the lighthouse was constructed. That afternoon, I tried to radio the mainland for information about the Morrow's Promise. The radio worked perfectly the previous day, but now I got nothing but static across all channels. Even the emergency satellite phone provided by the MSA returned only a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. I was effectively cut off. As the day waned, I found myself growing increasingly anxious about the coming night. I checked and rechecked the light, cleaned the lenses meticulously, and tried to convince myself that I was being irrational. Sunset came, and with it, the fog, thicker than the previous night, rolling in from the sea like a living thing, enveloping the lighthouse until I could see nothing beyond the beam of light as it cut uselessly through the white void. I stayed in the lantern room, unable to bring myself to go down to the empty quarters below. Hours passed. The mechanical rhythm of the rotating light and the distant sound of the foghorn from the automated station further down the coast were my only companions. Until the bells began. It started with one, the same ship's bell I'd heard the night before. Then another joined it, deeper in tone. Then another and another, until the air was filled with their ringing, coming from all directions through the fog. I pressed myself against the glass, straining to see. The light swept around, and in its beam I caught glimpses of them. Ships, dozens of them, surrounding the lighthouse in a vast circle. Vessels from every era, sailing ships with tattered canvas, steamers with smokestacks cold and dark, fishing boats and cargo vessels, and once grand passenger ships now reduced to ghostly hulks. They were all damaged in some way, broken masts, shattered hulls, twisted metal, yet somehow they stayed afloat, and on their decks figures stood motionless, all facing the lighthouse, facing me. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be real. I was hallucinating just like Welch had. The isolation was already affecting me. A sharp crack made me jump. One of the windows in the lantern room had fractured, a thin line running across the glass. As I watched, the crack lengthened and branched out, forming a pattern that looked disturbingly like a ship's anchor. Another crack appeared in a different pane, and another. The sound of bells grew louder, and now I could hear something else beneath them. Voices, hundreds of them, calling out words I couldn't quite make out. I fled down the spiral staircase, nearly falling in my haste. In the living quarters, I barricaded myself in the office, dragging a heavy bookcase in front of the door. My hands shook as I paged through Welch's notebooks, searching desperately for anything that might explain what was happening. In the final notebook, on a page I'd somehow missed before, I found a newspaper clipping from 1888. It detailed the inquiry into the disappearance of the first keeper of Barrow's End Lighthouse, a man named Edmund Barrow, the very man the point was named after. According to the article, before the lighthouse was built, ships frequently wrecked on the treacherous rocks around the point. Barrow, a wealthy shipping magnate, had funded the lighthouse's construction after his own son died in such a wreck. He insisted on being its first keeper, despite having no experience. 3 months after the lighthouse began operation, a massive increase in shipwrecks was reported in the area. When authorities came to investigate, Barrow was gone. The article noted that his logbook contained disturbing and fantastical entries about calling the ships to him. The final paragraph mentioned that Barrow had modified the Fresnel lens in some way that the investigators couldn't determine, but which they corrected before appointing a new keeper. A cold realization washed over me. I rushed back up to the lantern room, fighting against a wind that hadn't been there before, which seemed to push against me on the stairs as if trying to keep me away from the light. In the lantern room, the cracking of glass had stopped, but the windows were now covered in an intricate web of fractures. Through them, I could still see the circle of ships, closer now, their bells still ringing in terrible harmony. I approached the Fresnel lens cautiously. The massive apparatus continued to rotate, sending its beam out into the fog. I examined it carefully, looking for any sign of modification or tampering. At first, I saw nothing unusual. But as I moved around to the back of the lens, I noticed something etched into the brass housing, symbols similar to those I'd found carved under the furniture downstairs. They were subtle, nearly invisible unless you were looking for them, and they ran in a continuous line around the entire base of the lens assembly. The logbook from the barrel came back to me. The light guides us wrong. It is not a salvation, but a lure. Barrow hadn't built the lighthouse to save ships. He'd built it to destroy them, to call them to their doom on the rocks. But why? Revenge for his son, madness, or something darker? As if in answer to my unspoken question, the light suddenly changed color. The bright white beam took on a greenish tinge, then darkened to a sickly emerald. The machinery began to rotate faster than it should have been able to, the gears grinding in protest. Outside, the ships began to move, drawing closer to the shore, closer to the rocks that had claimed so many vessels before them. I tried to turn off the light, pulling the main switch on the control panel. Nothing happened. The light continued to rotate, its green beam sweeping across the water. I tried the emergency shutoff, then resorted to trying to physically stop the rotation by grabbing the housing. The metal burned my hands like fire, and I fell back with a cry of pain. My palms were blistered, but not from heat. The skin was blackened as if from extreme cold. The bells reached a crescendo, and the voices beneath them became clear enough to understand. They were calling a name over and over, not my name, not Welch's. Barrow, Barrow, Barrow. With horrifying clarity, I understood. The ships weren't being called to the rocks. They had already met their fate here decades or centuries ago. They were being called to the lighthouse itself, to the man who had doomed them. But Barrow was long dead, unless... I ran back downstairs to the office and tore through the historical records again. There it was, in a faded MSA personnel file, a requirement that had been added to the keeper position at Barrow's End in 1888 after Edmund Barrow's disappearance. All subsequent keepers had to be of suitable disposition and character to maintain the sacred trust of the light. I checked the list of keepers over the years. Every single one, including myself, shared a trait I hadn't noticed before. We were all former sailors or naval officers, all men who understood the sea, all men who had experienced the call of the deep, all men who could serve as a suitable replacement for Barrow. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The lighthouse didn't need a keeper, it needed a sacrifice. As if confirming my thoughts, a pounding began at the front door of the living quarters. Not knocking, this was the sound of multiple fists hammering in unison. The windows rattled in their frames, and a cold draft swept through the building, carrying the smell of seawater and decay. I had to stop the light, that was the key. Somehow the modified lens was maintaining the connection between Barrow, whatever remained of him, and the ships he had doomed. If I could break that connection, perhaps I could end this cycle. I ran to the maintenance closet and grabbed a hammer, then raced back up to the lantern room. The glass panes were now completely covered in fractures, obscuring the view outside, but I could still hear the bells and pounding. The green light continued to rotate, faster than ever. I approached the lens, hammer raised. The air around it seemed to distort, and the symbols etched into the brass housing began to glow with the same sickly green light. "This ends now," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was addressing Barrow, the ships, or myself. I brought the hammer down on the lens with all my strength. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. I struck again and again, each blow sending shards flying around the room, cutting my face and hands. The pounding at the door below grew more frantic. I could hear wood splintering, the barricade giving way. With a final, desperate strike, the Fresnel lens shattered completely. The green light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden silence was as shocking as the previous cacophony. I stood there, bleeding and panting, hammer still clutched in my hand. Had it worked? A soft glow began to emanate from the fragments of the lens scattered across the floor. They rose into the air, suspended as if in water, and began to orbit around the center of the room. The glow intensified, coalescing into a human shape, a man in an old-fashioned keeper's uniform, his face gaunt and his eyes empty black pits. Edmund Barrow. He reached for me with hands that seemed more like claws, his mouth opening to reveal darkness where teeth and tongue should be. "You've freed me," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "Now you must take my place." I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The windows behind me shattered inward, and cold, wet hands grabbed at me through the openings. The drowned crews of 100 ships, their faces bloated and fish-eaten, their eyes the same empty black as Barrow's. They began to pull me through the broken window, out into the empty air above the rocks. I fought, but there were too many of them. As they dragged me out into the night, I saw that the circle of ships had closed in, now directly below the lighthouse. Their decks were crowded with figures, all looking up, all waiting. In my final moments of clarity, I understood what had happened to Edmund Barrow, to all the keepers who had disappeared. We hadn't been replacements. We had been food sustenance for whatever ritual Barrow had begun in 1887. The hands released me, and I fell toward the waiting ships below. As the air rushed past me, I saw a green light flicker back to life in the lantern room. The cycle would continue. Another keeper would come. I never felt the impact. Instead, I found myself standing on the deck of a ship, the Morrow's Promise, according to the weathered nameplate. Around me, the crews of 100 doomed vessels went about their ghostly business, preparing for an eternal voyage. And in the distance, Barrow's End Lighthouse shone with its sickly green light, guiding new ships to their doom, calling new keepers to their fate. I'm still here, watching, waiting. Sometimes on clear nights, I can see the current keeper in the lantern room. He looks frightened. He's seen us. Soon he'll join us. And somewhere out at sea, a new keeper is making their way to Barrow's End, drawn by the promise of solitude and good pay. Drawn by the light that guides wrong, the light that lures.